Hi, I'm Ted Haftagaber, founder and producer of Live Talks Los Angeles. Thanks for joining us. Since we started over a decade ago, we have brought you hundreds of conversations with storytellers, writers, actors, musicians, humorists, chefs, and thought leaders in business and science. You can watch and hear most of these in our YouTube channel and our podcast. For details, visit livetalksla.org. And now, here's the show you've tuned in to see. We welcome Liz Fosslien and Mollie West Duffy to Live Talks Los Angeles, and we welcome back Lori Gottlieb. They'll discuss Liz and Mollie's book, Big Feelings: How to Be Okay When Things Are Not Okay. Liz and Mollie are the co-authors, and Liz is the illustrator of the bestseller No Hard Feelings: The Secret Power of Embracing Emotion at Work. They are also the duo behind the wildly popular Liz and Mollie Instagram account, an insightful and approachable illustrated guide to handling our most difficult emotions. Big Feelings is their new book. Lori is a psychotherapist and New York Times bestselling author of Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, which is currently being adapted as a television series. In addition to her clinical practice, she is co-host of the popular Dear Therapist podcast and writes the Atlantic Weekly's Dear Therapist advice column. Welcome to all attending, and I'll let you take it from here, Liz.
Great. Thanks so much, Ted, and thanks for having us. And Lori, we are so excited and honored to get to speak with you. Mollie and I have, I think, while writing Big Feelings, turned multiple times to your book for inspiration. Even before that, I think it provided both of us a deep sense of comfort. I love the therapist angle, the patient or the client of therapist angle. It's just such a wonderful book that I'm sure others also, it's helped them feel less alone. Certainly did that for us. We also quote you in our book, so we're big fans and very, very excited to be here with you today.
Well, I'm honored to be quoted in your book. I love your book, as you know. I think it's so important for people, and I'm really excited to have this conversation about our feelings today.
So let's start at the beginning. So one of the things that we heard when we were pitching this book to our editors, and this was pre-pandemic, was that they didn't feel that there was a big enough audience that would want to read about difficult emotions. And that all changed after COVID started, and the publishers came back to us and they said, we want to buy that book since people are definitely dealing with difficult emotions. So I'm curious, Lori, when you were pitching, maybe you should talk to someone, what kind of feedback did you get? And do you think that the interest in your book has changed at all during and after the pandemic?
So my book did come out right before the pandemic, and I had a very similar experience to yours, which was so many people said, oh, nobody wants a book about people sitting in a room talking about their feelings, which is not, by the way, what Maybe You Should Talk to Someone really is. And I don't even think it's a book about therapy. I think, like your book, it's a book about the human condition. And it's a book about a really important aspect of the human condition, which is what happens with our emotional lives and how do they affect the quality of our lives on a daily basis. And so, you know, it was interesting because we really couldn't get people interested in Maybe You Should Talk to Someone. And so it gave me a freedom, I think, to be really open and vulnerable in the book, because when, you know, I thought, well, 3 people are going to read this, so that's fine. And just for some context, the book follows the lives of 4 of my therapy patients as I help them through their struggles. But there's a 5th patient in the book, and that's me as I go through my struggles and I go to therapy to deal with them. And I really felt very free because I thought what publishers said was true, that no one's going to read it. And I wanted to make it the most real and authentic experience for the 3 people that did. And then, of course, you know, now it's sold over 1 million copies and lots of people have read it. And I think it's because, like with your book, people are really craving having these conversations. They're really wanting to be seen, to be heard, to be understood, to know that they're not alone. And then most importantly, to know, what do you do with all of these feelings? How do we use our emotions in a way that helps us lead lives of intention, that helps us lead lives of integrity, that helps us lead more peaceful lives. And I think that when we're kind of blindly going through our lives, we can feel it, but it comes out in other ways, like too much food, too much wine, insomnia, difficulty in relationships. And when you start really sitting with your feelings, something very different happens.
I actually want to dig into what you said, where you felt like you could be so vulnerable and free because you wrote the book under the assumption that 3 people would read it. And I want to know, obviously it's hard to look back, but if you had been told at the outset that 1 million people would buy this book, do you think that would have changed your writing process? And if so, why?
So I say at the beginning of the book that my greatest credential is that I'm a card-carrying member of the human race. And I really did not want to present myself as the expert up on high, because I really feel like we're all more the same than we are different. I think if I had known how many people were going to read it, I would have wanted to clean myself up a little bit. I think I would have done something in the editing process where I would have said, yeah, I don't really need to share that. Or yeah, I don't really need to show that, this was happening in this way at this moment. But I'm so glad I did, because I think that's what is drawing people to the book. And I know that in your book, both of you also share very personal stories in alternating chapters. And I'm wondering, how did you decide to write about the 7 emotions and to get so personal in sharing the stories?
Yeah, so we came up with the idea for the book pre-pandemic, and we both had hit periods of our lives where the traditional sort of self-help advice wasn't working anymore. So my father-in-law was losing his 10-year battle with cancer. The end of that is just horrific to watch. I was also commuting 3 hours a day to my job, had a lot of physical pain because of being in the car. I think it was also just the emotional turmoil manifesting as physical pain. And I was exercising, I had a therapist, I was journaling, I was doing meditation, and I just felt terrible all the time. So it was suddenly this idea that if you just think differently, you will feel differently, broke. And so that was really the genesis of the book. Mollie went through, I'll hand it to her in a second. She went through, an equally, maybe even harder time. And so I think for us, it was, we've felt all these different things. There's pieces of grief, anger, despair. How do we segment that? So we actually ended up talking to about 1,500 people who had read our first book, and based on those conversations, figured out the 7 emotions we wanted to pull into individual chapters. And then for the stories that we told, there were some chapters that it came really naturally. So for me, I already knew in my mind what I wanted to speak about with perfectionism, which is when I first started dating my husband, I presented this really manicured version of myself because I thought I had to be perfect for him to love me. And then when we started talking about moving in together, suddenly it was like, he's going to see me wearing these hideous sweatpants I don't want to get rid of. And he's going to watch me like squirt cheese whiz on a Ritz cracker. And that's my dinner, and it was like, oh my God, he's going to immediately break up with me. And that was not true. But it was really hard for me to understand that someone can love you, maybe even because of all these little quirks in yourself. And then others, Mollie and I iterated, and it's nice that we have each other to speak to figure out like, okay, this story is probably, maybe will resonate most with people, but also to your point is sort of the most unvarnished versions of ourselves, which is really what we strove to share in the book. And then I'll let Mollie kind of also share her answer.
Yeah. So for figuring out what emotions to write about, I mean, many of the emotions are overlapping. So we have a chapter on regret, which does overlap with comparison or a feeling of envy. And so we had to think about, well, how do we deal with these things? As you said, we're all humans and we have overlapping emotions, but still split them up. The chapter, the personal story that I share in the chapter on despair was very personal, and it took me a long time to decide that I did want to share it. And, it's about having suicidal thoughts, and we can talk about that in a second. But I think, it was important for me to think about what emotions have I had that might be helpful for other people to read about. And then, as Liz said, we also needed to find a balance of stories between us and also about different moments in our lives. So we weren't just all talking about the same thing. So we had many different drafts of stories that we didn't end up using.
Mollie and I have also talked about kind of as we've started promoting the book, it's very different to spill your guts diary style in your living room when you're just looking at a Google Doc versus suddenly now people are asking you about these really intimate, scary things that as a society also we're just not trained, or there's no opportunities really to talk about these, right? It's like, how are you? I'm fine. I'm great. And then the conversation moves on. And so I'm curious to hear from you. You write in, maybe you should talk to someone. No matter how open we as a society are about formerly private matters, the stigma around our emotional struggles remains formidable. We'll talk with almost anyone about our physical health, even our sex lives, but anxiety or depression bring those up, and it creates an intractable, bring up anxiety or depression or an intractable sense of grief, and the expression on the face looking back at you will probably read, "Get me out of this conversation pronto." And as a society, right, we're just afraid of those discussions. And why are we afraid? What makes us have that "get me out of this conversation" deer in the headlights look?
I think that it has to do with stigma, and I think it has to do with the ways that we separate physical health from emotional health as if they are separate, which they are not. And, I see this so often in the therapy room where people have this hierarchy of pain. So we don't have that with our physical selves. So if you fall and break your arm, you're going to go to the doctor and get an x-rayed and, get a cast and whatever needs to happen. You're not going to say, well, I'm not going to take care of my arm because somebody else has stage 4 cancer. So on the hierarchy of pain, mine's not really that bad. I can handle it. I'll just tough it out. We do that with our emotional health, though. So if you're having oh, well, I'm feeling sad, or I'm feeling, I've been a little anxious, or I'm having a little trouble in my relationship, or maybe a lot of trouble. We kind of say, well, it's not that bad because, I have a roof over my head and food on the table, and compared to, and whatever the emotional equivalent that you compare it to, it's not that bad. And we just kind of think that we can power through it. And that's not actually what happens. When you push down your feelings, they get bigger, and they come out in behaviors. They come out in too much food or too much wine, or, relational difficulties or insomnia or whatever. And you see it. So you're not actually very successful at doing that. And it's kind of like if you have, chest pain, you're going to go to the cardiologist before you have a heart attack, hopefully. If you have some kind of emotional pain, people land in my office when they're having the equivalent of an emotional heart attack. And so often I see that where, first of all, it's harder to treat at that point because now we've got to get you kind of back to baseline and then deal with the underlying issues that got you there in the first place. And the worst part for me, the most heartbreaking part, I think, is that somebody has suffered unnecessarily for sometimes weeks or months or years when they didn't need to.
Yeah. We both have so many reactions to that.
Well, I think that's why I really was drawn to your book, because I think it was again another example of how much we can find connection and freedom through people just being authentic and then helping us to understand and ask questions and examine our own emotional lives. I think we don't get enough of that because, again, we have this hierarchy and we feel like our problems are not, high enough on the hierarchy.
Yeah, I had an experience recently with a friend, and Mollie, then I will toss it to you, where I was doing that exact thing you're talking about, where I said I was just going through a lot at the time, was completely burnt out at my job, but said, I have the roof over my head. I'm very privileged. I have this good life. I shouldn't be suffering. And she said, think about it from the other side. If you got a promotion today, none of your friends, and you probably wouldn't be like, well, Jeff Bezos still has so much more money than I do. So you're not going to tamp it down on the positive side. So why are you putting so much pressure on yourself to tamp it down on the negative side? If you just feel this, you feel it, and it's fine. And so I found that really helpful. Mollie, I will cede the floor to you now.
That's a great description. I wrote that down, hierarchy of pain. In our book, we talk about, I got advice from my friend who's a social worker, and she said, I don't believe in comparing levels of suffering. When you're in a low place, that's the place that you're in. And that was really helpful as something to hear. The other thing you mentioned, Lori, was that people generally with physical health at the first sign of a symptom, unless they're trying to avoid it, go and talk to a doctor about it. But we don't always do that at the first sign of emotional distress. And it's so true. And I just want to read this because I love this section from your book. You say, patients arrive, if not at their worst, then certainly not at their best. They might be despairing or defensive, confused or chaotic. And then you say, so they sit on your couch as a therapist, look up expectantly, hoping to find some understanding and eventually, but preferably immediately, a cure. But therapists don't have an immediate cure because these people are complete strangers to us. And that was exactly my experience. I started working with a new therapist when I moved to Los Angeles from New York, because I couldn't see my old therapist because of insurance anymore. And I was in an extremely depressed space and then eventually started having these suicidal thoughts. And it took patience for me to work with my therapist through, it was over the course of honestly 2 years. And it was sort of like, well, help me because this is so hard. And I really don't want to be in this place right now. And I need to get out of it as soon as possible. But that's, it's not how these things work. And we write in our book, there's no shortcuts out of big feelings. So I'm curious, how have you found ways to help people who are in moments of emotional crisis be patient through them?
Well, I think what you're saying is true, that the only way out is through. And I think it's really my job as a therapist to be both a witness and a guide, and to really hold the hope for the person that they aren't able to access in those moments and at that time in their lives, because I can see through the tunnel where maybe they can't. And I think that, there's this idea that you come to therapy and the therapist is going to kind of, solve this for you somehow. And I really believe that people have the ability to heal themselves, but they need someone to help them, to accompany them on that path, on that journey. And so a lot of the therapy, when you talk about the patients, a lot of therapy isn't just what happens in the room, it's what happens in the space between the sessions. It's what do you do with what happened in the room when you're out in the world? And sometimes in your case, where you were really dealing with something very, like these very, very dark thoughts, it's going to take a while for you to really understand what those are about. And it's when we're in pain, we want this kind of immediate release from our pain. And I think that that's where holding the hope comes in with the therapist doing that. But I also think that people need to understand it requires work. I'm sure you did a lot of work in between sessions. And I think when you're feeling the way you were feeling, the last thing you want to do is feel like I have work to do, because you can't really do anything. You can barely get out of bed probably. But I think it's really about the internal work, and it's a process. There is no quick fix, and that's the bad news. But I think the good news too is that there's no quick fix, because I think that we live our lives across this timeline, and there are always going to be times when we struggle, and there are going to be times when we struggle less. And if we can learn how to manage when we're struggling, that's what's going to help us the most.
Mm-hmm. I love
that. I think that when you guys were working on the book, it must have been hard. One of the things you disclosed just now was, that you were having these suicidal thoughts. And I'm wondering, when you were writing the book, what some of the misconceptions were that you had about dealing with difficult emotions before you wrote the book. And then how did you think about that after you wrote the book, after you went ahead and revealed all of this?
Yeah, I think we wrote the introduction actually after we had written a large chunk of the chapters. And so we bust sort of 3 myths about big feelings in the introduction. And at least for me, those were many of the myths that I held before we started writing. So one that I really believed, and it's interesting because we had been talking about this for so long before we even started writing the book. And so even though I was saying that there aren't actually bad feelings, emotions aren't negative or positive, they're just something that's going on within us, I didn't realize how much I still had that belief within me until I started reading the book and writing the book and talking to so many other people, and really felt a lot of shame around some of the stories that I shared in the book. And Mollie called me out on this, actually, that the first draft of all the personal stories that I shared very much ended with a nice bow wrapped around it. I struggled with perfectionism in my relationship, but then I saw a therapist, and now I'm married, and it's fabulous all the time. And Mollie was like, that's not true. You're just doing the same thing you always do, which is just put it in a box and then put it on the shelf, and it's in the past. So I think that it's fun. I wasn't even aware that I was doing that. I just thought it's like, this is a story and this is how you wrap up the story. So then the stories have definitely shifted to, I say it's still, sometimes I still feel ashamed for being anxious. For my husband is also so emotionally stable. It's shocking to me. And so there's still times when I'm like, today, I don't know why, I just feel really down, and I'm just flagging that to you. It's harder for me to say that than maybe for others. So I think this really shedding this idea of some emotions, the moment you feel them, you should also pile a bunch of guilt and shame on top of that for even feeling them in the first place. I'm still working to lose that. But I think I've just learned to give myself a lot more grace. And that's part of what Mollie and I hope that the book does for other people too, is that it just normalizes that, like, if you sign up for life, this is life, right? Like, if you get to live long enough, you will go through these really, really hard periods. You will lose things you love, people you love. And it's okay. Even if it feels really hard, you're not alone in that.
Yeah, it's so interesting, because I was thinking about how sometimes in therapy, I'll have people sitting on the couch and they'll start crying and they'll say, I'm sorry. And I'm kind of like, do you see the 3 boxes of tissues? Like, one on each side and one on the couch. Like, that's why they're there. But, even in a therapy office, people will apologize for feeling sad. So I think what you're saying is it's so universal that somehow we feel like, we have to apologize for feeling, that there are certain feelings that we label positive feelings and certain feelings we label negative feelings, when they're all just feelings. That's what makes us human. That's what makes us feel alive, is that we feel the whole range of feelings.
One thing, Liz, when you were talking, that just made me think of, I was listening to a podcast the other day, but it was Kate Bowler, who's an author who I really admire. And she wrote a book called Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved. And she has a podcast, and she had another author on, Suleika Jawad, who wrote a memoir of having cancer called Between Two Kingdoms. And Suleika said when she was writing, she had this Post-it taped up on her computer screen that said, if you want to write a good book, write what you don't want other people to know about you. If you want to write a great book, write what you don't want to know about yourself. That is so true. And I think, Lori, you spoke to it earlier, of like writing for 3 people and wishing, maybe that you had painted yourself in a different light. And I think that the act of writing this book in some ways helped me process some of the big emotions that I had felt, and seeing them on screen sort of helped me, sort of have a bird's eye view of them and feel more compassion for myself than maybe I had when I was just thinking about them as, this shameful thing that I had felt. And another thing we bring up in the introduction that I think we both learned is that we had felt, and many people feel, that their feelings are more intense and volatile than most other people's feelings. We're like, well, we're the exception. No one else has such strong emotions. And for most people, that's probably not true. And we did a survey of our readers, and 99% of them shared that they had struggled with a big feeling over the past month. And we don't know what other people are carrying and what they're going through, but these feelings are a lot more common than we think, and you probably see that as a therapist as well.
Yeah, I absolutely see that, and I think that gives me a different perspective from somebody who's not a therapist, which is that I know how universal this is, but I think other people who go through their lives and their exposure is to Instagram don't really know.
Yeah, completely.
So Lori, you write openly in the book about patients who have had suicidal thoughts, and you say whenever suicide comes up, either because the patient or the therapist broaches the topic, bringing it up does not, as some worry, plant the idea in a person's head. I'm really glad you say that. The therapist has to assess the situation. Does the patient have a concrete plan? Is there a means to carry out the plan? Gun in the house, spouse out of town? Have there been previous attempts? Are there particular risk factors? Often people talk about suicide not because they want to be dead, but because they want to end their pain. If they can just find a way to do that, they very much want to be alive. We make the best assessment we can, and as long as there's no imminent danger, we monitor the situation closely and work with the depression. And I had highlighted this passage. So, in the book I share I had suicidal thoughts. I was dealing with a lot of things going on, mostly due to chronic pain and not understanding what was causing the pain, and then going to a new doctor when I first moved to LA who did an experimental procedure that made the pain worse. And I was so ashamed that I had done that. I thought there was no way to fix it, no way out. And so I shared these thoughts with my husband, with my therapist, and then eventually with a few close friends. But honestly, one of the biggest things that I wish existed in our world is more stories of people who have had suicidal thoughts, who end up okay, who don't act on them. I'm also glad that there are stories of people who do act on them, so we can reflect on the tragedy that is. But I think for many people have these thoughts, and we don't always see what happens to them at the end. And in the middle of this, I was thinking, these thoughts are so intense, I will never recover from them. Like, there's no going back. Like, once I've had these, what I labeled as sort of like psychotic thoughts, I was like, what do I do? How do I recover from this? And, obviously my therapist was helpful in sort of sharing many people have these thoughts. So I'm curious, like, is that something you share with your patients, that more people have these thoughts than we realize and are able to recover from them? And what do you share with them?
Well, first of all, I think that when people are very depressed, one of the things that I often say is that you are not the best person to talk to you about you right now. Because I think that when we are that depressed, we lose a lot of perspective. We are, we go into kind of this tunnel vision. And it's because of the pain. And I think you're right. I wish that people knew how often people that they would never suspect, get very, very depressed or have something happen in their lives that has them, feeling like, I don't know if I can get through this. Just having these really, really dark thoughts. There are lots of people who think about suicide or have thought about suicide at one time or another and haven't acted on it. There are also people who have acted on it and then they survived, and they were so glad they did survive. Most people who survive, and you could look at studies on this, the studies show that most people are so grateful that they survived. So I think, again, just like all the other feelings that you talk about in your book, I think that they're very universal and people just don't realize it. And I wish that, I hope so many people read your book and read about this very vulnerable thing that you shared, because I don't think I've seen that really anywhere else in the same way that you shared it here and in the context in which you shared it. And it so normalizes it, because I think people would look at you and say, really? I can't believe she felt that way. But you did, and it was so real and relatable.
Thank you.
And I'm wondering, you were asking, what I say to people when they come in like that. And I'm wondering, you have been to therapists yourselves. What is the most valuable thing that you each learned from them that you think might be useful for anyone who's listening to this conversation?
Yeah, a lot of what you actually said, just normalizing it and having them remind me, like, your emotions are valid. You're not the only person to feel like this. But one particular thing that has just stuck with me for a long time, and I share this in our chapter on perfectionism. I mean, I've had perfectionism show up in many, many aspects of my life. The first job I ever had, I started getting severe migraines. And I remember one night I passed out 3 times because the migraine was so intense. So I went to the emergency room, was there all night, slept not at all. And then the next morning, it was a Tuesday, so I went into the office because I was just like, I just have to go to the office. I can't call in. I just somehow it just was, looking back, it's ridiculous, but I just had this, like, I cannot fail. I have to keep going, going, going. And I remember my manager at the time, we had a meeting and clearly something was off. And then he finally asked me, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "Well, I was in the ER last night." And he was flabbergasted. And to his credit, he said, you need to go home and don't come back for the rest of the week. But then again, that showed up in my relationship later, and has shown up, I think, in many aspects. And so I did eventually start working with a therapist who, among many other helpful techniques, once just posed the simple question of, what was an experience that you really enjoyed with a pet? And so it made me think of, there was this little Persian cat that a family member had, and, it was like old, it was wheezing, it smelled bad. It was just this very problematic cat. But I loved her so much because she was this little grumpy fluff ball. And I just remembered this one afternoon when I wasn't feeling that good, and she came and she sat in my lap very lovingly and kind of wheezed and made the room stinky, and it was not like the ideal pet to hang out with, but I loved that afternoon. Like, I loved this little warm creature on my lap. And my therapist said, Sophie was the name of the cat. Sophie wasn't telling jokes. Sophie was not a vice president at a bank. Sophie couldn't even talk to you. Sophie was actively making the room smell bad, and like, it still brought you comfort. And so couldn't you apply that a little bit to your life? That, like, maybe just by being there, you bring your boyfriend comfort, and you don't always need to be like on your A game, the comedian of the room. And so there are many other things that have helped me, but I come back to that a lot of, sometimes it really is just enough to be there and to be there for someone. And that is, I think it takes the pressure off of me often to be like, I need to fill the space with things, and I need to, like, be doing jumping jacks to entertain this person to be worthy of their time.
Yeah, I think that we don't really understand the value of presence. And I mean real presence, not just being in the room, but just being present with someone, being open to them, being available for them. Both the giving and receiving of presence is so important for our emotional health.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for my, what helped from my therapist, one of the things that she said to me, and again, to go back to what you wrote, Lori, it wasn't that I wanted to kill myself. I was like, that sounds horrific. I don't want to do that. But it was just that I didn't want to be alive anymore, because being alive was really painful physically and mentally at the moment. And I said, I just want to give up. Like, I'm just so weary. I don't want to do this anymore. I don't have the energy to do this anymore. And she said to me, that doesn't sound like you. That doesn't sound like the Mollie that I know. And it was a very simple sentence, but it kept me going for a while. And I was like, well, she sees something in me that I don't see. And I had a friend who also had suicidal thoughts, and his therapist said something to him that said, if you were gone, I would miss you, and it's these very simple sentences, which I think, therapists, again, is about holding that space and having that presence, to keep people going for a little bit, when they feel like they can't.
Yeah, that reminds me, one other thing that comes to mind for me is my therapist really likes to talk about parts of yourself, and that I've found that really helpful, that if I'm really anxious in a moment for seemingly no reason, I'm just like, this part of me is anxious, and all the other parts of me that I love and am proud of are still existing. And so how can they all come together to help this anxious part of me? So I think also not seeing yourself as like, I feel depressed, therefore I am a depressed person, and that is the only element of myself that exists now or ever will. And you kind of talk about this impermanence that we can feel very strongly in some moments or in some periods, and then that doesn't necessarily doom us to that experience forever. And so this is actually the line from your book that we quote because we loved it so much. Sometimes in their pain, people believe that the agony will last forever, but feelings are actually more like weather systems. They blow in and they blow out. Just because you feel sad this minute or this hour or this day doesn't mean you'll feel that way in 10 minutes or this afternoon or next week. And my husband has actually learned sometimes, especially in the evening, if I'm starting to feel down, he'll be like, time to go to bed. We're going to bed. We're going to wake up tomorrow. And then if this is still a thing, like, I'm really happy to talk to you about it, but I think you might just be tired and, these things will pass. And so I'm curious to hear, when we talk about grief, depression, what are, again, the just other things that you have found helpful in helping people recognize that these are weather systems, that they will pass? Like, is there, or I guess even for you, when you were really going through it, what was most valuable for you to hear?
Well, first of all, I think that we learn at a very young age to talk ourselves out of our feelings because we get talked out of them. So often, like, kids will come to their parents and they'll say, I'm so sad about this. And then the parent experiences discomfort because they don't want their kid to be sad. And so we say, oh, it's really not that bad. Or we try to help them look on the bright side. Or we say, hey, let's go get some ice cream instead of talking about what they're sad about. Where they're like, oh, I'm so worried about this. And they say, oh, don't worry about that. It'll all work out fine. And so we kind of talk people out of the experience of sitting with their feelings. And if we could instead let them sit with their feelings, they would see for themselves that it is like a weather system, that it's here right now, and maybe in an hour it won't be, or maybe at the end of the week it won't be. When you have that experience for yourself of seeing that feelings kind of blow in and blow out, it's very powerful because you don't feel so trapped by whatever's going on, because you know that you're going to move through it. So I think it's important, just as parents or anybody who interacts with younger people, to help let them sit with their emotions. But we can also do that with our partners. Often, like, your partner comes to you with something and you want to fix it for them, or you want to make them feel better, instead of just really like sitting with them in whatever feeling it is. Like, it's cloudy in their world, go sit in the cloudy weather with them for a little bit. Instead of saying, like, come over to the sunny side.
Let me try to fix this for you.
Right. Yeah, and I think that has to do with learning how to listen to people. And I think that's why people really enjoy going to therapy, is because finally somebody is really listening. Because I think that when we go to people out in the world who don't know how to listen, what we do is we give people what will relieve our own discomfort with what they're saying, or we give them something that we would want in that moment, but isn't necessarily what they want in that moment. So, we never say to someone, tell me how I can be helpful right now. Do you just want a hug? Do you just want to vent? Do you want to hear some ideas about what I think about this? Right? Because people know what they want. And if you could just really listen and give them what they want, and like a weather system, they might want something different 2 days from now. They might say, the other day I just want to vent to you, but now I'm actually been thinking about it more, and I'm wondering what you think about this. So
I had a very emotionally intelligent friend who, and this has also stuck with me for years, who actually did that. I was like, I'm really upset. I want to talk to you about something. And he said, okay, just before you go, do you want me to help you fix it? Do you want me to just listen and kind of comfort you? Or do you want me to get mad with you? What do you need from me? And at that moment I was like, I think I want you to get mad with me. That sounds amazing. So yeah, I've tried to do that for friends too, or if they've been going through a hard time, sending them a text saying, like, here are 3 things you can call on me to do whenever. You can text me anytime. I will make you food. I will, just pick up the phone. So I love that you brought that up too, of people often do know what they want, and it can be really comforting to sort of help them pick or help them communicate what that is.
Yeah. And I think it also helps them with that impermanence idea, which is that then they feel some relief, and then there's the intensity of the feeling goes down a bit.
I had an experience, I read about this in the book, where I had a friend who was going through a really hard time when we were both in college. She was going through a pretty bad depression. And I, at the time, had not experienced anything like that. And so, I'll blame my youth. I didn't know how to respond. And my response to her sort of was what we've been saying of like, well, can't you just, look on the bright side of things? And I reached out to her like 2 years ago after I had sort of gone through this period of despair. And I said, I'm really sorry that I wasn't there for you in the way that I could be, and that I didn't react in a less judgmental way when you were going through your depression. I had no idea what you were going through, and I said the wrong thing, which she really appreciated. So I think the other thing is we may not always get it right in the moment, but you can always reach back out after too and say, looking back on this, I wish I had said something different.
Yeah, I think that's what we talk about with rupture and repair in any relationship, which is we're not always going to get it right. It's how you do the repair that matters.
Mm-hmm. So you write in your book about the many career transitions that you made, which I also really appreciate. I think, again, in the spirit, this is the general theme of this conversation, like, let's be more open about these things that everyone does. And I imagine there must have been some big feelings that went along with those career transitions. We have, in our book, we talk about the feeling of comparison or envy and regret, and how sometimes listening to those emotions, even though they're difficult to listen to, can help us, especially when thinking about career transitions, in figuring out what it is that you want to do. So how did listening to your emotions help you move from entertainment to medical school and then to becoming a therapist?
Well, you're right about how our emotions lead us that way. And when we were talking earlier about sort of negative and positive emotions and how all emotions are really positive, because they're really like a compass. They tell you what direction to go in. If you're feeling sad, it's saying, oh, I need to go into that to understand what it's telling me. What is the message there? I need to go in that direction. If you're feeling anxious, what's not working? If you're feeling angry, is somebody not respecting your boundary? What is going on there? I think with envy, the same thing. I always say, follow your envy. It tells you what you want. Mm-hmm. And I think that we have so much trouble just identifying and embracing our desires, because we feel like, oh, well, that's a crazy idea, or I shouldn't, this is good enough. I shouldn't really have that desire, or that would be so unconventional to do that right now, which is what I did, all these unconventional moves. But I think I just kept looking at what I really wanted, and lots of people told me that what I was doing was crazy, but I did it anyway. And I'm really glad that I did. So, people might say, oh, well, you went to medical school and then you left, so that was a bad idea. No, it was a great idea, because it taught me that I wanted to be a writer. And then being a writer taught me that I wanted to be a therapist. And I do all of those things in different ways, in terms of, how I deal with story and the human condition in my career now. So I have this I have this hybrid career that I probably wouldn't have had if I hadn't had all of those experiences. And so I think, keeping in mind, I always say this, I said this in my TED Talk too, which is that we're all going to die. And I know that sounds really morbid, but it's like knowing that life has 100% mortality rate, and that that's not for other people, but you're in that 100% too, I think helps us live with intention and helps us say, what do I really want? It's nobody else is going to be living my life. So whatever they think about the career path or the choices that I make isn't really that relevant, because they don't live with the consequences of those decisions. I live with the consequences of those decisions. So I'm not making choices for their lives. I'm making choices for my life. And I think that's so important. I don't know if you had a similar experience when you were thinking about the various changes that you've made.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think there's, deciding to write. And I think there's aspects of writing that are really hard. It's you have to put things out there, as we've talked about. You have to put personal things out there. You have to market yourself. You have to build a brand. I mean, there's all these things that come with it. But I've always loved writing, even since I was a child. And I think it took a while of being sort of a young adult in my 20s to say, no, this is like, I still love books. I still love authors. I still love this world. And I want a piece of that. And so I just have to figure out, like, what does that look like, given the sort of financial realities of things, but how can I make that work?
I'm actually curious, because you didn't just write this alone, you wrote this together. And Liz, I would love to hear about the illustration process. And I'd just like to hear from both of you on what it was like to write something like this together.
Yeah, it's to go back to your previous question, which very much ties into the illustration process. For context, my parents both immigrated to the US. They're academics. They're very emotionally closed off. They had me when they were older, grew up in very different circumstances, and also under, like my mom, now it's coming out that she was anxious as a child, but she had just never thought about her emotional state in her life. And it was only when she was talking with me about this that she was like, oh, I felt those things too. So it's interesting to watch her have this emotional awakening in the process of me writing the book. But they very much instilled in me, like, study something quantitative. They really wanted me to go to medical school, get the job for 40 years, do that. And so for me, I studied math and economics in college. I passed out at the sight of blood. So that was sort of like my, apology medical school journey. It was like, I'm sorry, but I'm still studying, like, numbers. And just really hated the career. I went into economic consulting and it just really wasn't creative at all, wasn't for me. So I think when it comes to illustration, and I actually still have flashes of this, sometimes I feel embarrassed when people are like, what do you do? And I'm like, oh, I draw cartoons. And then I just kind of like crunch in on myself, because it's still not this picture of like banker, lawyer that my parents instilled in me as like what you need to be successful or to be smart, even though the people that I look up to most are very creative and are like you are one of them, like very involved in the emotional world and have crafted these super interesting, unique careers for themselves. I think it's definitely been a journey for me to even just like put an illustration out into the world confidently and not be like, oh, it's not math,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry that it's just a picture. But the process, I think when it comes to writing, and then I'll hand it to Mollie, because I always love to hear her perspective too. What's been interesting is we have very complementary skill sets that when we first started working together made us butt heads. And so it was because we're so different, I think we initially perceived that as irritating, as opposed to stepping back and being like, actually, this is an incredible partnership. So Mollie's really good at like filling the blank page and getting started and just putting ideas onto the page. And I love to come in with the little lawnmower and kind of mow the lawn and edit and obsess over the syntax of things. And so initially, I think I would get these 10,000 word Google Docs from Mollie and be like, what am I looking at? And then I would spend weeks, burying through them, moving things around. And Mollie was like, what is going on your end? Like, I haven't heard from you in a month and you're just like obsessed with this one word on page 20. And so it took a lot of hard conversations for us to suddenly say, oh, this is great. Liz doesn't like to fill the page. Mollie's really good at it. And then you can hand it off to me. And we've also, I think, both learned from each other. So I'm a little less obsessive. I think Mollie's sort of, at least what I get is not the 10,000 words, it's like the 6,000 word version. But yeah, Mollie, curious to hear your perspective.
It's true. So I think the nice thing about co-writing with someone else is that when you get to the point where you're stuck, where you're like, I've looked at this chapter for way too long, I have no idea what to do with it, how to fix it, we can swap. So the way that we write is we'll each take chapters, write an outline, swap, give each other feedback on the outline, then do the first draft, swap, and it keeps going back and forth. So whenever we get to the point of being stuck, we can just throw it to the other person versus having to go to our editor. I mean, we do go to the editor eventually. And by the end, I can't tell you what line is my line and what line is Liz for the most part. There are some lines where, and obviously in our personal stories, that's, but it's all been passed back and forth enough times that we can't get there. And yes, my tendency is to be verbose and Liz's tendency is to be short. So that works better together. And then we also have differing opinions about when to send something to our editor. So I think, I'm usually more like, let's check in earlier along the way to make sure we're headed to the right direction. And sometimes Liz wants to, wait a little bit longer, so we negotiate that. But overall, like Liz said, we've had to learn how to have difficult conversations also about, being financial partners in publishing a book, and how do we deal with that? And both, having separate careers. And I think one of the biggest things that we have implemented is to bring up any issues when they are still small. And this is, something that my husband and I do as well in our relationship, which is like, before it becomes a big thing. It's actually what you were saying earlier, Lori, of like, we'll try to deal with it before it becomes an emotional catastrophe. But so like, if something's bothering me, even little things like, hey, Liz, can we keep our Google Drive more organized? Or if I text something to Liz and she's like, hey, can you actually email me about this? Because I'm going to forget if you just text me. Like all those little things we bring up, and we know that we're doing it for the sake of the relationship so that they don't snowball into bigger issues, so that we can have those conversations earlier on.
Yeah, anytime I talk about our partnership, my friends are like, I can't believe you talk about that. It's so emotionally mature. And I was like, do you know what we write about? You would know.
Yeah, we have to
communicate. Lori, I mentioned this just now of how you are one of these people who have such an interesting career that you've crafted for yourself with many, many pieces. So since your book came out, you published a workbook and started a podcast. You still work as a therapist. You write the Dear Therapist column for The Atlantic. Your book is being adapted for TV. I think it's just so incredible to read that list. And I'm curious, do you ever get overwhelmed, or how do these avenues complement each other? I'm just curious how you think about all of that as, you're one person with these many different pieces of your career.
Well, I think that one of the goals that I have is, and sort of, this has become my mission, is that I really want to democratize emotional health and therapy. And I feel like there are lots of different ways to do that. I have a clinical practice where I can do that one-on-one with people, or, with a couple or family. But when you also can put those ideas out there in a book, or you let people hear, on the Dear Therapist podcast, we actually do sessions with people. So you can hear actual sessions. So it's not just the privacy of the room, but lots of people can benefit from that. Same with the column in a different way. And the workbook, I kind of feel like I'm giving people the step-by-step guide to editing their stories the way that I would do in the therapy room with somebody one-on-one. So I think that they're all very complementary, and they all fit into this goal that I have of really making this accessible to everyone. And it was interesting what you said about working together, because, I work with Guy Winch on my Dear Therapist podcast. So people get two therapists on there with, and we don't know what's going to happen. Like we have to work together as two therapists who, just like in regular therapy, you just don't know what's going to happen in that session. And it's been really interesting. I think it really helped me grow as a therapist and as a person to, I think one of the things you talk about in your book is sort of perfectionism and control. And when I'm in the therapy room, I can do, I'm in control of what I decide to do. But when I'm working with Guy, he might be going down some path, and I'm kind of like, where's he going with this? What is happening right now? But I trust him enough to know that wherever he's going is going to get us to a good place with the person who's in the session with us, and vice versa. And, and I think that you're right. Like when you are doing a creative project with someone where the product itself, like your book, like our podcast, traffics in feelings, it's so much easier to talk about whatever's going on between the two of you, because you're already dealing with that in the work that you're putting out. And so I'm wondering, just as we conclude here, the book is Big Feelings. What do you think is the biggest lesson that you both learned from Big Feelings that you want to share with people that they can learn as well?
Mollie, do you want to kick us off? I need a moment. I'm going to put you on the spot.
Yeah. I think one of the themes that came up again and again, which I think about in my day-to-day is sort of black and white thinking about things. So feelings, not good or bad, they just are. Whereas previously I had put them into buckets of good and bad. Or things like, in our perfectionism chapter, we talk about how when you are in the throes of perfectionism, you feel like, well, I can't give up this perfectionist habit, because if I do that, I'm going to get fired from my job, or I'm going to become a couch potato, or so we go from like one extreme to the other, and this, you would probably know more about this, but it feels like as humans, that feels easier or safer if it's like, it's either this or this. And I really am trying to pull those things apart a little bit more and be comfortable, where it's like, I think sitting with some of the emotions and saying, okay, I don't need to act on those right away, or there's not two choices. Like there's many different options here for how I can move forward if I pause a little bit and think about what these things are, rather than labeling them as two options or good or bad.
Yeah. For me, it's tracks back to what you said about people showing up when they're having an emotional heart attack. And I think in writing this book, I really reflected on how many times in my life, because I haven't worked through the emotions or haven't listened to what my emotions were telling me, I actually had like the physical, not a heart attack, but I mean, it was like my body would just shut down and it would say, you're done, you're getting sick. And then I would feel, terrible, but also relieved, because it was like, okay, I don't have an excuse to look at I don't need to look at my email because I'm violently ill on the couch. And that's just like a horrible way to live and to work through your emotions. You're not really working through them. You're just being forced to stop. For me, the biggest lesson is the normalization, but then also the piece around like just listening to the early warning signs. And we talk about this a lot in our chapter on burnout, where it's this, if you suddenly find yourself thinking like, oh, I just wish I would get sick, that's a sign that you just need to slow down. And then I think it's not only listening to that, but it's having the confidence and the reminder of what you said too, like, I'm going to die. I need to live the life that feels true to me. I don't need to do all of these things. Who am I doing them for? What is actually okay to take off my plate that allows me to be more true to myself, both in terms of like what I value, but then also in terms of just what I need to not be ill on the couch in 2 months. So it's something we've talked about throughout this entire conversation, of just the like, put in the work every day to listen, to acknowledge, to understand what is going on within you, what that should tell you about yourself, and then have the courage to act on that.
Well, I just want to thank you both for writing this book. I think it's going to be helpful for so many people. Certainly something that I think everybody in therapy, out of therapy, just human should read, because I think that they're going to relate to everything that you write in there. And I think that people need to have books like this where it's something that they don't get in, like you were saying, your daily conversations. And I hope that it starts to change the conversation. I think it will.
Thank you
so much. Yeah. And same for your book. I think you kind of pioneered a lot of this work.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Mollie. Thank you, Lori. And thanks to all of you for joining us. Again, Liz and Mollie's book is Big Feelings: How to Be Okay When Things Are Not Okay. It is available wherever books are sold, and signed copies are available in the link below and also in the comments section. Thanks, and as we like to say around here, please go on gently.